Welcome to another episode of Data Gurus. I'm really excited to welcome Darrell Bricker, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Ipsos Public Affairs. Welcome, Darrell.
Thanks for having me on, Sima.
Thank you. That's a big title and a lot of responsibility.
Well, it's the title, but it's really more of the opportunity than the responsibility.
That's cool. Yeah.
The great thing about being at Ipsos is it has the best platform in the world, I would say, for doing global public affairs research, which is essentially a new kind of thing. I mean,
Yeah.
we've always, in the modern era, have had the capability of doing survey research in many developed countries, but the idea that we can now start polling the world and actually doing research, meaningful statistical research in very many countries across the world is fantastic. And Ipsos has always been a big supporter of doing that. So, as I said, it's not so much the responsibility, although there are
Yep.
responsibilities that
Yeah.
go along with it. It's the opportunity.
Very cool. And I want to get to that because I think not many people understand that body of work. And I'd love to delve into it. But before we do, I always like to give our listeners a little bit about the journey of our guest as to how you got to this point in your career.
Well, I don't know what to tell you other than I went to university. I'm a working class kid from Nova Scotia who ended up in Cambridge, Ontario. My dad was in the Air Force. My mother was a cashier at the local grocery store. So nobody in my family went to university. My brother and I were the first two to do it.
That's
Uh,
amazing.
that's Canada too.
Okay.
Canada too. I think my story is very much a Canadian story. I mean, the
Nice.
opportunities that I've been given are very much a product of the good fortune I've had to be born in the country that I've been born in. And so anyway, I went to university, went and did a PhD in political science at Carleton. I always had an interest in doing statistical types of research and ended up in the polling business, doing political polling, and worked at a company called Decima Research, where Alan Gregg, I was his research assistant. And those of your listeners viewers who know anything about polling in Canada will know that an awful lot started with Alan Gregg, and I had a great opportunity and learned tons of things from Alan. Then I left Decima and I went to the Prime Minister's office where I was a director of research for about a year and a
Wow.
half. And then I went to this little company from Winnipeg called Angus Reid. And
We
we
all now know that company.
we know Angus Reid, but Angus Reid's a real person and he is an
Yes.
incredibly cool guy. And I've had probably one of the only people in the Canadian research industry that had the opportunity to work with both Alan Gregg and Angus Reid
Wow.
and become friends and allies with both of them. And I regard them as, incredible mentors.
Mhm.
So worked for Angus for about 10 years. And then we got an offer we couldn't refuse from a French research company called Ipsos.
There you
And
go.
yeah, and we sold Angus Reid to Ipsos in 2001. And they were interested in starting a public affairs business. And I happened to be here and they happened to have a desire to get that going. So I ended up being the first CEO of public affairs at Ipsos globally. And I've been doing this ever since.
What a great, career, and it's so nice to have mentors along the way that you respect, and they invest time back into you as helping your career and your trajectory, so, I think it's important as we, research professionals give back to to the younger generation to help them, uh, coach and guide their careers as well, so, anyways, small tangent there. A little plug for all of us giving back. Okay, so let's talk about what is public affairs?
Well, it's funny that the term public affairs is usually associated with government relations or PR or
Yes.
whatever. But it's actually Angus Reid when we were trying to describe what our public sector or NGO public opinion business was that came up with the idea that we should maybe call it public affairs. So
Nice.
we started calling it public affairs at Angus Reid, and then when we were
Okay.
acquired by Ipsos, we had a discussion, and it was should we call this public sector? Should we call it public opinion?
Mhm,
And they really liked the term public affairs that we had at Angus Reid,
mhm.
so they decided to continue with that. So in spite of the fact that I do have people, kind of give me a bit of a squint when I say responsible for public affairs, And even people who come into work at Ipsos, what is this public affairs thing? When you start talking to them about what we do, it becomes pretty obvious. We're the part of the business that deals with people more as citizens
Mm,
than as consumers.
I
So
love that.
we're not trying to sell people anything. Basically, what we're trying to do is understand the issues that are animating their lives. We work a lot for governments. We work a lot for NGOs. We basically, based on the research that we provide, I don't want to sound too grandiose, but just to sound a little
Sure.
grandiose,
Yeah.
it's our job to speak power,
Yeah.
speak truth to power. And so what we do is we provide information about what's going on in the world
Mhm.
to people who make decisions generally in the public sector, but also in NGOs. But about 20% of our work is also for the private sector, where we help them understand things like political risk.
Mm, interesting. And, in this day and age, there is so much to understand. Like, is it and is it different from the last, let's say, like, the last 5 years have been really, I don't wanna say challenging, but a lot of things have been shifting. Is that really different from the last 30 years, or are we just living it and it feels like it's so much?
I think we're living it and it feels like it's so much. But yeah, there has been a lot of shift, particularly through the pandemic. I mean, I
Yeah.
can't say that there's anything comparable that's taken place in the 60 odd years I've been on this earth. I mean,
Yeah.
there's nothing that's taken place like that. And increasingly, what we're seeing is that issues tend to become more global in scope. So
Mhm.
understanding, where your country fits in this global context, understanding and measuring what the world thinks. Quite frankly, 15 years ago, we were never able to do that.
Right.
The idea
Right.
that you could do a global poll was a fantasy. Maybe somebody might do something that looked like a poll once a year on, and try to cover up sections of the globe. But the idea that you could actually do that in almost real time was a fantasy. Now it's a reality.
Real
And,
thing.
and
Yeah.
yeah, it's a real thing. And so the ability to collect that information and report back to your clients, or in some instances, we do a lot of work. The public affairs work, our public affairs group at Ipsos tends to handle our media work. So
Mm.
we're the most active in that space, but we can also hold up a mirror to society using all of these great instruments and data platforms and everything else that we have at Ipsos to say, this is what's going on. This is what the truth is. So you can, push aside your disinformation, your fake news, or your whatever about what the public
Right.
thinks about things. Here's the truth.
When you talk about global, obviously that's significant that you can do almost real time global polling and get insights and real time or not. Um, how many countries do you cover? I'm just curious as it relates to that.
Well, we have public affairs businesses that we're active in about 40,
Okay.
where we've got significant activity going on.
Yeah.
A fewer than that, probably around 30, where we have teams of some presence on the ground. But
Mm.
our reach is basically anywhere in the world you need to go. There's a few countries where you can't do polls. You can't do a poll in Iran, for example.
Right. Right.
You can't do a real wide open public opinion poll in Russia or in
Mhm.
China or
Mm.
certain countries that are more authoritarian regimes. It's harder to do. In fact, the ability to do a poll is a good measure of whether or not how the country is a free marketplace or
Sure.
a free society. Can you do a reliable public opinion poll? But in many countries we can.
Mhm.
And particularly in the developed world, we can do it very quickly. But in the developing world, the capability is really coming around.
Mhm. And also, there's more technology. I mean, I think the mobile phone has allowed so much more access to not consumers, all
Pardon me.
citizens. Sure, across the globe.
Yeah, the mobile phone has, and the reason that it is so powerful is that it's
Mm.
ubiquitous. Like
Mhm.
we're going to talk about my book Empty Planet that I
Yeah.
wrote with John Edmondson in a couple of minutes, but there's this great scene in which I'm in a slum in Delhi, and I'm talking to people in a situation of the most abject poverty. I mean, in a slum,
I know. Yeah.
and there's a flash under a woman's sari, and she
And you
reaches
could
down and she pulls out a
the phone.
smartphone and she puts it
Yeah.
back, and it's okay. Well, there's the world changing.
I wanna touch upon, a little bit about what has been, for you, as you've been in this role, some of the most interesting shifts you've seen in citizenship. Um that you could share? Obviously, there's content that's proprietary, but from your own, when you stand back and you look at the body of work that you've been involved with, are there things that are really, like, stand out from the rest in terms of citizenship?
I think that the decline of deference is a real thing. So the
Oh, that's
idea
interesting.
so the idea that you would simply accept what
Mhm.
people in positions of power or authority tell you to accept
Yeah.
is no longer the case.
Okay.
And the degree to which citizens can push back in an organized way
Yeah.
is beyond anything that I can ever remember seeing.
Yeah.
I mean, even in my own country, like Canada,
Mhm.
the idea that you would have, new political parties emerging and
Mhm.
new political movements emerging, um, that just wasn't really a thing. I mean,
Right.
it was a thing maybe back in the 1930s or times when we had, we're kind of organizing our society, but it seems like we're going through a bit of a reorganization of
Mhm.
all of these things. And the degree to which technology has enabled the public to build up its own view of what the
Mhm.
world is, good, bad, and mixed, is
Right.
something that is brand new. So the communications environment is much more complicated.
Mhm.
The media is completely fractured and
Yep.
fragmented,
Yep.
and the ability to communicate with people has become, at the same time, easier and harder.
Yeah.
It's harder if you're trying to do it the old way, like through television advertising or through, the old techniques of marketing.
Mhm.
But it's easier in the sense that we have more reach because of things like, for example, that idea of that woman pulling out the smartphone,
Yeah.
you know, in a slum in Delhi. So the level of flexibility, creativity that you have to have in order to engage
Mhm.
with that environment is something that I think has challenged a lot of marketers, challenged a lot of people in media, is certainly challenging a lot of people in politics and government.
Do you think that, a way to influence citizens is more on a grassroots level now, in that it's more connected to a community or a group or a tribe where, you kind of share a narrative versus kind of the broader social media and, advertising landscape? I don't know if that's true, it's a hypothesis.
It's a really good question because everybody's struggling with this, So
Yeah.
it is
Yeah.
all about hypotheses right now
Yeah,
because nobody
right.
really has any facts. I mean,
Yes.
all of this stuff is an evolution. But what I would say is everything these days is nascent. So everything is possible.
Okay.
And that means that trying to rely on things like, for example, a good one is political parties.
Yes.
Political parties used to be organizations that had broad networks within communities that represented not just somebody that you voted for, but somebody that you were part of. That doesn't
Yes.
exist to the same degree that it used to. So politicians, this is why you see such volatility in political communications these days,
Mm.
because in political outcomes these days is because the things that you used to be able to rely on, you can't rely on to the same degree. And for people who are in the public opinion polling business, like I am,
Yeah.
the ability to look at what the past was and project it into the future is no longer as relevant as it
Yeah.
used to be. So all elections these days are volatile, and all of the action takes place in the last 4 or 5 days of the campaign. And you just don't know what's going to
You
happen
don't
yet.
know. Yeah.
So the old idea that, if somebody was a Democrat or a liberal or,
Mhm.
a socialist or a conservative or
Mhm.
whatever in the past, well, they could be anything these days.
Mm.
So
Mhm.
volatility, speed, and then combining that with the ability to reach them in all sorts of different ways is a complicating situation. But in the old days when we used to do political polling, and I'm old enough that I can say old days, uh, that getting a political outcome incorrect was like falling out of a boat and missing the water.
Yeah.
90% of people responded to a telephone survey. They had very good, very good, like I said, incredibly good response rates. They were very, very accurate. It was
Yeah.
incredibly easy to do. These days, there's nothing that 90% of the population
Yeah.
responds.
Exactly.
So you have to
Yeah.
construct samples in very, very different ways. But it's just not in politics. It's like it's happening not to us in politics. People who are
Across
working
the
in the
board.
marketplace and doing
Yeah.
market research, and
Yeah.
anybody dealing with data, you're struggling with the same thing.
Yeah.
You may not know it though.
Right,
You
that's
may not
true.
acknowledge it, but
Yeah,
if you're embarrassed enough, as pollsters get embarrassed all the time by the events that take place related to your predictions, you learn pretty fast that you have to be very flexible and very doubting of everything that you
yeah,
do. I used to spend a lot of time simply trying to explain to people why things were right. And if you did them this way, this is the outcome you would get. These days, the biggest skeptic of everything we do is me.
got it. What I'm sorry, say that again? The biggest
The biggest skeptic of everything that we do is me.
good
And,
for
and,
you. Yeah, you
but
question everything.
yeah, because you need to. And by the
Mhm.
way, social science is about that.
Yeah,
And everybody
yeah,
who's listening to this who is in market research or doing anything with data, we stand on the shoulders of giants. The
yeah.
methodologies of social science have been developed over centuries,
Mhm,
and they've all worked themselves into difficulty over the space of the last while when it comes to marketing and
mhm.
public opinion, market research and public opinion research. But the original intention of kind of inductive reasoning and the way that you look at issues and the way you evaluate things by starting to eliminate all the null hypotheses,
Right.
come up with the right answer is still the best way to do it. So I
Yep,
spend a lot of my time just saying, okay, how are we wrong? How are we wrong? How are we
yep.
wrong? How are we wrong? And rather than doing what I used to do, which is saying, we're never wrong and you really need to listen to us.
That's interesting. That's an interesting shift. Um, we said the decline of deference. I guess I'm also curious about this idea of how we evaluate people in the public sector. Does that is that has that changed? Like, is it different from what it was before, or this is all the same? We just know more of it because everything's digital.
Well, I think that the biggest thing is the way that people look at politicians has
Mhm.
evolved.
Okay,
And it's no longer, who's the smartest person in the room. It's
hmm
the person that you can feel an emotional connection to. And
got it.
emotions is a very big part of politics. And I think that, political scientists, and I come from that
Mhm.
particular discipline, have always looked at these things as being very rational. One of the things I've learned over the years is that it's not necessarily about rational. Who has the best answer? It's about connection.
Mm.
It's about emotion. It's about matching the mood of the country in the right
With the
way.
person, right?
So the type of measurement that we do these days is much less about things like, okay, what's the most important issue and who has the best answer?
Mm.
I mean, that's one way of getting
Sure.
getting at it. But the other part is, how much emotional connection do you have with them?
Mm.
Not would they be a good person to have a beer with? But it's much more complicated than
Right.
that. It's like who is the best matching who provides the best
Yeah.
match to the mood that you're in right now.
Yeah.
And that's something we're all struggling to measure. And it's how you explain somebody like Donald Trump.
Yes. I
Why
know.
why is he so effective? He seems
Yes.
to have kind of a superpower to be able to
Yeah.
match the mood really better than any other politician he's faced.
It's
Doesn't mean you
amazing.
can't beat him, but he's very good at that one particular thing.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I didn't consider the emotion part. That's actually a really good point because I think so much of maybe this is just me, but there's people that are quote unquote maybe more driven by values versus emotion, and so that's a dichotomy there in terms of how are people connecting to different. And I won't name a candidate, but different candidates that might be so off on both extremes. It's an interesting, phenomena.
Yeah, well, it's what you think your vote is doing.
Yeah.
So why would you vote for Donald Trump?
Mhm.
Because you think he's the most honest person on the ballot? No. Because you think that he is the smartest person on the ballot? Probably not. But do you
Mhm.
think he's going to challenge the elites? Condescend to you?
Yeah. Yeah.
The best? Yeah, you probably do.
Yeah. And that's the connection.
And that's why it's emotional. Now, the values part of it is interesting, and the separation between what our values and what our emotions are
True.
maybe not as
Very
not as
true.
clear
Yes.
as putting them in two specific categories. But it's how you pull all of that apart.
Yeah.
By the way, I hate the term unpack. Just for anybody listening, the only people who unpack are when you get your groceries in your house, or you
And
go
you
to the grocery
unload
store,
'em.
or you're a mover.
I
Okay,
love that. Yeah.
yeah, you explain,
Yeah.
you don't unpack.
Oh my gosh, that's too good. Okay, so let's I just want to take a brief pause here and talk about anybody interested in doing the type of work you're doing, what what are the types of skills well, let me start by saying the way you talk about research is so different than when you think about a lot of the industry. You still have the rigor, you're still, you know, methodologically driven, excuse my, frame there. What skills, what knowledge, what should people really be focused on if they wanna do something in the public affairs area?
Social science.
Okay.
So I don't care what discipline you come from in the social sciences, but social science. We need people who understand the scientific method and
Mhm.
understand the research techniques that flow out of that. And your bias has to be that. You have to be somebody that is interested in the world,
Yeah, for
not
sure.
just interested in pushing products and that
Right.
kind of thing. Not that market research isn't incredibly important,
Sure. Yeah.
but if you're interested, if you're that part of things, the commercial part of things is really your biggest interest. You start reading the newspaper as to the extent that people read newspapers in the
Yeah.
business section.
Right.
Public affairs probably isn't your thing.
Sure. Okay.
The people who are in public affairs tend to be people who start in the front section of the newspaper and want to know what's going on in the community, want to know what's going on in the world, want to know about what's happening on big political, social
Yep.
issues. They're not people who are necessarily interested in whether this company is going to buy that company.
Yep. Got it.
So that's the kinds of people who come
It's the
into.
bias that you have in terms of where's your interest, your curiosity about the world and different areas of the world.
Yeah, and so what I find is when I deal with the 1,500 colleagues we have in public affairs at Ipsos,
Mhm.
you get them on a virtual call or you get the leadership together in a room. They're very very similar everywhere.
Got
And,
it.
and I could summarize them the way that some just summarize them. They tend not to be MBAs, although
Mhm.
some of them may have MBAs. They tend to be, PhDs and MAs
Mhm.
in social science. They may have had spent some time in government. They may have spent some time in the public service. They may have spent some time with an NGO. The kinds of issues that really drive their interest are the big public issues that are confronting the world. They're
Yep.
not so interested in whether or not we can expand our market share
Mhm.
of this particular product in
Mhm.
that particular place.
That makes a lot of sense. So I want to switch over here a little bit if you don't mind about the fact that you're an author and you've published how many books?
Seven.
It's amazing. And I know the most recent is about Canada, I believe. But the one that I wanted to focus on a little bit is the book about the planet. And you identify some key trends around what you anticipate is going to happen to the planet. Can you just share a little bit more insight there?
So it's a really simple premise. It's is the global population going to increase or decrease? And if so, why?
Mhm.
And basically, what the premise of the book is that in fact the global population is going to peak and then start to decrease around mid-century, and how far it's going to decline, nobody knows. And the
Is a
reason is
question.
because we've basically stopped having babies. So the whole book is about. And by the way, there's only one chart in the entire book. It's
That's amazing.
Yeah, because we didn't want it to be a numbers book. We didn't want it to be an academic book. We wanted it to be something that somebody could sit down and by when I say we, John Ibbotson from the Globe and Mail, who's the writer at large there,
Okay.
wrote the book with me. And we wanted a book that anybody could read and understand what is probably going to be the most important issue that is going
Mm,
to confront humanity over the space of this century. The idea that what we've done is we've basically given up on creating the next best generation.
mm.
And the reason for that, we can get into if you want to talk about it,
Yeah, I would love to. Just a
but
couple. I want
ultimately,
people to read
ultimately,
the
it's
book.
we've just
Go.
decided we just don't want to have kids. And the birth rate of Canada today. I mean, I'll just start talk about Canada. Then you can ask me about
Sure.
any other country because I can probably tell you what that one is too.
Yeah.
But the birth rate of Canada back in 1960 was about around four. So the average number of children a woman had in her lifetime was about four. She probably got married around the age of 21, 22, started her
Yep.
family shortly after, and she had four. That's what my mother did.
Yeah.
Today, the average Canadian woman gets married, if at all, at around 30 and has maybe one kid, maybe two, but more likely one. So the birth rate has
Really?
gone from 1 to 1.3.
That's amazing.
To replace the number of people who die in a country every year, you
Yeah.
need to have a birth rate of 2.1. That's
Mm.
one for your partner and a little bit extra for kids who don't grow into adulthood and can't have kids themselves. Today, Canada is at the lowest birth rate in history. So
Wow.
is the United States.
Yep.
So is the UK. So is France. So is Germany. So is Japan. Canada's birth rate actually looks like Japan, but China's birth rate is 1.
Yeah.
They're
Well,
going
they
to
instituted that a million years ago. Not a million years ago,
They
but
took it off about 5 or 6 years ago, and
okay.
they haven't been able to move it up. In fact,
Really?
it's continued to decline.
Okay.
And India's birth rate is now below replacement rate. The 2 largest countries in the world are India and China.
Yeah.
India's just past China, and, both of them China's gonna lose about half of its population. India's gonna lose about 300 over 300,000,000 people from its population this
Wow.
century. And the interesting thing about everything that I'm telling you is that you're going, "Wow." I mean, but because nobody talks about this.
Yeah. No,
But the
nobody talks about it.
implications are huge. So we're going to peak and then we're going to come down. But along the way, what's going to happen is we're going to get very old very fast. So by 2030, the entire global baby boom is going to be 65 years of age or older. By 2040, 2050, they're going to be leaving this mortal coil.
Right.
The implications of this are enormous.
Right, because who's left? It's the population's much smaller.
Well, also, the group that's going to be the biggest group is the oldest group, and they're the ones who don't buy new things.
Right.
They
Yeah.
sit on the resources they have. They also use a lot of healthcare services.
Right.
They also have big pensions. They also
Mhm.
sit on all the best homes. They have all the investments. And then you've got another generation that's going to be following them that's going to be expected to pay for that. And it's shrinking every day.
Yeah. So what do you attribute to the low birth rate? Why are people not wanting to have children?
Well, we basically, if you go out and you do surveys and you ask people why they don't want to have kids, number one answer is, I just don't want them. Uh, well,
I get it.
it's a big
Yeah.
responsibility, right?
It's a huge responsibility, yeah.
And then the second one is I can't have them.
Okay.
And the reason they can't have them is generally biological, but
Yeah.
also the inability to find adequate partners to raise children with.
And do you
So,
raise them by yourself or do you raise them right? The
and, al-
construct
and
is with a
almost
partner.
and almost nobody does. So if you
Right.
raise a child by yourself, you didn't start that way.
Right. Got it.
You tended to have been in some sort of a relationship with somebody
Mhm.
prior to. So those are the big reasons. I mean, you'll get people who will say things like climate change. Then if you say the climate is perfect, would you have kids? I don't know.
Maybe not. Yeah.
Or, kids are very expensive, and if they were cheaper, I'd have more of them. Yeah, so if you make kids free, would you have more of them? Yeah, maybe not. So we're the first, couple of generations in human and actually in world history of any species that have said, "You know what? The next generation, that Darwin thing, we're supposed to be competing to create the next best version." Yeah, that's somebody else's job.
Mhm. Well, I also think I talk to a lot of young people, and a lot of young people say, "I don't wanna have kids. The world is crazy. It doesn't feel safe." I don't know if you heard any of that in your
Yeah,
research.
there's certainly people say that.
Yeah.
But then if you said to them, "If the world was left crazy, would you have more
Would you
kids?"
still have yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
And the answer is, well, maybe you made me think, but then I get caught up on did I wait too long because I thought the
Right.
world was crazy? And
Right.
but the single two biggest factors that are affecting global population fertility are number one, urbanization.
Mm.
So what's happened is we've become a more urban society. We've become a less fertile society.
Mm.
And that's really because, kids have lost their economic raison d'etre. On the
Mhm.
farm, they can feed the chickens. In the city, they're just an
Mhm.
expense. So
Right.
we tend to do things that are less expensive. But really what has happened is we've seen a fantastic and very positive change in the lives of women. So
Mhm.
now when they move to the city, they see different role models as to how they can live their lives rather than living in, patriarchal societies.
The traditional right.
And they say, "Hey, I don't have to live the life of my mother or my grandmother."
Mhm. Mm.
But that means that I'm going to have to delay when I start having my kids and probably have fewer of them because I need to get an education in order to have an
Mhm.
independent income, and I need to have a job in order to have an independent income. And then when they turn their attention to the idea of having a family, it starts to get complicated,
Mhm.
more complicated than it was for their grandmother or their mother.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, it's all very positive when it comes to empowerment and people being able to make choices about how they want to live their lives, but there are consequences to that, and this is one of the consequences.
it's really fascinating. And I also know a lot of women who are career focused who say, you know what, I might want to have kids in the future. I'm going to freeze my eggs. Hopefully, at that point in time, I'll be able to have children. But to your point, you have a window, right, to be able to do that.
They
Even if,
almost never do.
yeah,
That's
is
the
that
interesting.
right?
Yeah, it's one of the myths is that people freeze their eggs and then they have
Uh,
them later. It's very few that do it.
but they do freeze their eggs. They might not have kids later. You're saying many people don't do it,
They could do it,
but
and many do, but many
yeah.
is just like a number, but as a relative number, as a percentage of the population, it's quite small.
Mm.
Whether or not they actually uh, follow through on that and actually produce children
Hmm. Hmm.
when they're ready to with those frozen eggs, other than being in a partnership and they're dealing with IVF and all sorts of other
Right.
very it's very complicated. I mean,
Yeah.
things that since we only make kids really the old-fashioned way, and I mean, even IVF is sort of a version of the old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
Well, is that it's the older a woman gets, the harder it's so hard once you get
Yes.
to the age of 30, and it just really declines very rapidly after the
Right.
age of 30. And women have, uh, in many places in the developed world, have basically not started trying to have kids until they're
Mhm.
in their 30s
Mhm.
when it's much harder.
Mhm.
And so, even if the will is there, the biology is working against you. So it's a complicated situation that all adds up into, this peak pretty soon
Yeah. Yeah.
and decline pretty rapidly after that. And the implications for it are probably worthy of another book.
Yes.
But John Evanson and I were basically writing about why is this happening,
Interesting.
and what
Yeah.
I've just told you is why.
Very fascinating. I feel like we could talk for hours. I truly have enjoyed our conversation. And if you want to announce another book now, you can. But or
Oh,
maybe
I'm
it's
always thinking of something. I've got a couple ideas that are percolating. We'll see what comes next.
that's fascinating. Thank you so much for joining me today, Daryl. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sima.